The Heart Mountain War Relocation Center, named after nearby Heart Mountain and located midway between the towns of Cody and Powell in northwest Wyoming, was one of 10 concentration camps used for the internment of Japanese Americans evicted from the West Coast Exclusion Zone during World War II by executive order from President Franklin Roosevelt after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This site was managed before the war by the Federal Bureau of Reclamation for a major irrigation project. Construction of the 650 military-style barracks and surrounding guard towers began in June 1942, and the camp opened on August 11, when the first Japanese Americans arrived by train from the Pomona, Santa Anita, and Portland assembly centers. The camp would hold a total of 13,997 Japanese Americans over the next 3 years, with a peak population of 10,767, making it the third largest town in Wyoming before it closed on November 10, 1945. Heart Mountain is best known for many of its younger residents challenging the controversial draft of emails from camp in order to highlight the loss of the rights through the incarceration. The Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, led by Frank Hemme and several others, was particularly active in this resistance, encouraging internees to refuse military induction until they and the families were released from camp and had their civil rights restored. Heart Mountain had the highest rate of draft resistance of all 10 camps, with 85 young men and 7 Fair Play Committee leaders ultimately sentenced and imprisoned for Selective Service Act violations. In 1988 and 1992, Congress passed laws to apologize to Japanese Americans for the injustices during the war and to pay compensation to survivors of the camps and the descendants. The site of the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center is considered to retain the highest integrity of the 10 incarceration centers constructed during World War II. The street grid and numerous foundations are still visible. 4 of the original barracks survive in place. A number of others sold and moved after the war have been identified in surrounding counties and may one day be returned to their original locations. In early 2007, 124 acres of the center were listed as a National Historic Landmark. The Federal Bureau of Reclamation owns 74 acres within the landmark boundary and currently administers the site. The remaining 50 acres were purchased by the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, a non-profit organization established in 1996 to memorialize the center's internees and to interpret the site's historical significance. The foundation runs the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, opened in 2011, located at 1539 Road 19, Powell. The museum includes photographs, artifacts, oral histories and interactive exhibits about the wartime relocation of Japanese Americans, anti-Asian prejudice in America and the factors leading to their enforced relocation and confinement. Establishing the camp. Pre-war history. The land that would become the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center was originally part of the Shoshone Project, an irrigation project under the auspices of the Bureau of Reclamation. In 1897, 120,000 acres of land surrounding the Shoshone River in northwestern Wyoming was purchased by William Buffalo Bill Cody and Nate Salisbury, who in May 1899 acquired water rights to irrigate 60,000 acres surrounding Cody, Wyoming. After the project proved too costly for the original investors, the Wyoming State Board of Land Commissioners petitioned the federal government to take it over. The rights for the Cody-Salisbury tract were transferred to the Secretary of the Interior in 1904, and the Shoshone project was approved later that year as one of the earliest Bureau of Reclamation projects. In 1937, during the Great Depression, the Bureau used private contractors and civilian Conservation Corps laborers to begin construction on the Shoshone Canyon Conduit and the Heart Mountain Canal. As one of a number of governmental infrastructure projects, the conduit, spanning 2.8 miles, was completed in September 1938. Construction on the unfinished canal stopped after the United States entered World War II. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized military commanders to create zones from which any or all persons may be excluded. The War Department had requested this and designated western Washington and Oregon, southern Arizona, and all of California as exclusion zones in March 1942. It defined Japanese Americans, Italian Americans and German Americans as peoples to be excluded from these areas. Soon after, the War Department initiated the removal of over 110,000 Japanese Americans from these areas, forcing them into temporary assembly centers run by the Wartime Civil Control Administration. Typically, these centers were hastily converted large public spaces, such as fairgrounds and horse racing tracks, while construction on Heart in Mountain and the other more permanent relocation centers were completed. Building Heart in Mountain. On May 23, 1942, the War Department announced that one of the camps for displaced Japanese Americans would be located in Wyoming, and several communities, hoping to capitalize on internee labor for irrigation and land development projects, vied for the site. Heart Mountain was chosen because it was remote yet convenient, isolated from the nearest towns but close to fresh water and adjacent to a railroad spur and depot where Japanese Americans, as well as food and supplies, could be offloaded. On June 1, 1942, the Bureau of Reclamation transferred 46,000 acres of the Heart Mountain Irrigation Project and several CCC buildings to the War Relocation Authority, the branch of the Western Defense Command responsible for administration of the incarceration program. More than 2,000 laborers, including men employed by the Hartzer Engineering Company of Chicago and the Hamilton Bridge Company of Kansas City, began work on June 8 under the direction of the Army Corps of Engineers. The workers enclosed 740 acres of arid buffalo grass and sagebrush with a high barbed wire fence and 9 guard towers. Within this perimeter, 650 military-style barracks were laid out in a street grid with administrative, hospital, educational, and utility facilities, and 468 residential dormitories to house the internees. All of the buildings were electrified, which was at the time a rarity in Wyoming, but due to time constraints and a largely unskilled workforce, the majority of these buildings were poorly constructed. Army higher-ups gave the site's chief engineer only 60 days to complete the project, and newspaper ads recruiting laborers promised jobs if you can drive a nail, while workers boasted that it took them only 58 minutes to build an apartment barracks. Thousands of acres of surrounding land were designated for agricultural purposes, as the center was expected for the most part to be self-sufficient. World War II. Life in camp. The first inmates arrived in Hart in Mountain on August 12, 1942 to 6,448 from Los Angeles County, 2,572 from Santa Clara County, 678 from San Francisco, and 843 from Yakima County in Washington. After being assigned a barracks based on the size of the families, they began making small improvements on the new apartments, hanging bed sheets to create extra rooms, and stuffing newspaper and rags into cracks in the shoddily constructed walls and floors to keep out dust and coal. Some inmates went so far as to order tools from Sears and Amp Roebuck catalogs in order to make repairs. Each barracks unit contained one light, a wood-burning stove, and an army cot and 2 blankets for each member of the family. Bathrooms and laundry facilities were located in shared utility halls, and meals were served in communal mess halls, both assigned by block. Armed military police manned the 9 guard towers surrounding the camp. Leadership positions in Hart Mountain were occupied by European-American administrators, although NSA block managers and NSA councilmen were elected by the inmate population and participated, in a limited capacity, in administration of the camp. Employment opportunities were available in the hospital, camp schools and mess halls, as well as the garment factory, cabinet shop, sawmill and silk screen shop run by camp officials, although most inmates received a rather paltry salary of $12–19 a month, due to the WRA's decision that the Japanese could not earn more than an Army private regardless of job. Additionally, some inmates worked on the unfinished Hart in Mountain Canal for the Bureau of Reclamation, or did agricultural work outside the camp. Children of inmates began school in barrack classrooms in October 1942. Books, school supplies, and furniture were limited. Despite the poor condition of the facilities, attending school offered a sense of normalcy to camp children. In May 1943, the camp high school had been constructed, and the elementary school restructured. The high school, which educated 1,500 students in its first year, featured regular classrooms, a gymnasium and library. Its sports team, including its football team, the Hart Mountain Eagles, eventually competed against other local high school teams. Other sporting events, movie theaters, religious services, crafting groups, and social clubs kept inmates entertained and provided a distraction from the dullness of camp life. Knitting, sewing, and wood carving were popular not only for entertainment, but because they allowed inmates to improve the dilapidated living conditions. Among children, Girl and Boy Scout programs flourished, as many NSA had been members before internment. Hart in Mountain's 13 Scout troops and 2 Cub Scout packs were the most of any of the 10 camps. Scouts participated in normal scouting activities such as hiking, craft making, and swimming. Draft resistance. In early 1943, camp officials began to administer a leave clearance form, better known as the loyalty questionnaire, because of 2 controversial questions that tried to distinguish loyal and disloyal Japanese Americans. Question 27 asked whether men would be willing to serve in the armed forces, while question 28 asked inmates to forswear all allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Many, confused by the questionnaires wording, fearing it was a trick and any answer would be misconstrued, or offended by the question's implications, answered no to one of both questions, or gave a qualified response like, "I will serve when I'm free." Soon after, Kiyoshi Okamoto organized the Hart Mountain Fair Play Committee to protest the infringement of NSA citizen rights, and Frank M. Paul Nakadate and others began posting flyers around camp encouraging others not to respond to the questions. Meanwhile, the Army's previous restrictions against Nisei were lifted in order to create a segregated unit of Japanese-American volunteers. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team began active duty in Europe and Northern Africa in 1944, and quickly became known as the Go for Broke unit because of the degree to which its soldiers risked their lives in battle. The most highly decorated unit in the war, it also suffered an extremely high casualty rate and soon required replacement troops. When fewer than 1,200 Nisei volunteered for service from the U.S. mainland, camp inmates were added to the draft pool to fill the gap. While some Japanese Americans welcomed the opportunity to prove their loyalty to the country of their birth, others saw it as a further insult. When draft orders began arriving in Heart Mountain, Emi Okamoto and the other leaders of the Fair Play Committee held public meetings to discuss the unconstitutionality of the incarceration and encourage other inmates to refuse military service until the freedom was restored. On March 25, 1944, 12 Heart in Mountain resistors who had not reported for their draft physicals were arrested by U.S. Marshals. Emi and 2 other committee members who had not received draft notices tried to walk out of camp to highlight the status as prisoners of the government. In July 1944, in the largest mass trial in Wyoming history, 63 Heart in Mountain inmates were prosecuted after refusing to show up for their induction and convicted of felony draft evasion. A total of 300 draft resistors from 8 WRA camps, including an additional 22 from Heart Mountain sentenced in a subsequent trial, were arrested for this charge, and most served time in federal prison. The 7 older leaders of the Fair Play Committee were convicted of conspiracy to violate the Selective Service Act and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, while the Poston concentration camp in Arizona had the highest number of resistors of any camp, at 106. Heart in Mountain's 85 resistors from a much smaller population gave it the highest overall rate of draft resistance. Although Heart Mountain is remembered primarily for its organized resistance to the draft, approximately 800 Nisei joined the U.S. Army from this camp, either volunteering or accepting the conscription into the famed 442nd. 15 of these young men were killed in action and 52 wounded. Joe Hayashi and James K. Okubo posthumously received the Medal of Honor for valor in battle, making Heart in Mountain the only one of the 10 WRA camps to have more than one Medal of Honor recipient. In late 1944, camp inmates erected an honor roll in front of the administration building listing the names of these soldiers. This wooden tribute stood for 5 decades, until the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation removed the deteriorating display for preservation. An accurate reproduction, completed in 2003, now stands in place of the original. The original honor roll is being conserved and restored. The end of the war. By the time Roosevelt rescinded Executive Order 9066 in December 1944 and announced that Japanese Americans could begin returning to the West Coast, the following month, many had already left camp, most for outside work or to attend college in the Midwest or East Coast. Beginning in January 1945, internees began to leave Heart in Mountain for the West Coast, provided by administrators with $25 and a one-way train ticket to the location they had been picked up from 3 years earlier. However, even with the earlier group of resettlers, only 2,000 had left by June 1945, and the 7,000 still remaining within Heart in Mountain for the most part represented those who were too young or too old to easily relocate. Many Japanese Americans, barred from owning the pre-war homes and farms by discriminatory legislation, had nothing to return to on the West Coast, but they were prohibited from homesteading in Wyoming by an alien land law passed by the state legislature in 1943. Another Wyoming law excluding them from voting further discouraged Japanese Americans from staying in Wyoming. The last trainload of former inmates left Hut in Mountain on November 10, 1945. Preservation and Remembrance. After Hut in Mountain closed, most of the land, barracks and agricultural equipment were sold to farmers and former servicemen, who established homesteads on and around the campsite. The Hut in Mountain irrigation project continued after the war, and much of the camp's surrounding acreage was tilled for irrigation agriculture. Remnants of the hospital complex, a Hut in Mountain High School's storage shed, a root cellar, the Honor Roll World War II memorial and a portion of the remodeled barrack are the only buildings still standing today. The Hut in Mountain Wyoming Foundation, established in 1996, has worked to preserve and memorialize the site and events, educate the general public about their Japanese American incarceration, and support research about the incarceration so that future generations can understand the lessons of the Japanese American incarceration experience. The Hut in Mountain Wyoming Foundation is overseen by a 16-member board of directors and is led by the chair, Shirley Ann Higuchi, a descendant of former internees. The board also includes former internees, scholars, and other professionals working on the local and national level. The Hut Mountain Wyoming Foundation gained National Historic Landmark status from the site in 2007 and on August 20, 2011 opened the Hut Mountain Interpretive Center. The center features a permanent exhibit that provides an overview of the history of the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans and the background of anti-Asian prejudice in America that led to it, along with additional rotating exhibits. These photographs, artifacts and oral histories explore the incarceration experience, constitutional and civil rights issues, and the broader issues of race and social justice in America. Visitors can also participate in a walking tour of the site and its remaining structures. Former U.S. Secretary of Transportation Norman Y. Mineta and retired U.S. Senator Alan K. Simpson, who met as Boy Scouts on opposite sides of the barbed wire fence surrounding the Hut Mountain compound, act as honorary advisors to the foundation. The foundation hosts an annual pilgrimage at Hut in Mountain, the first of which coincided with the Interpretive Center's 2011 opening. Terminology. Since the end of World War II, there has been debate over the terminology used to refer to Hut in Mountain and the other camps in which Japanese Americans were incarcerated by the United States government during the war. Hut Mountain has been referred to as a War Relocation Center, Relocation Camp, Relocation Center, Internment Camp, Incarceration Camp, and Concentration Camp, and the controversy over which term is the most accurate and appropriate continues to the present day. Scholars and activists both have criticized internment camp as euphemistic, as Japanese Americans were not there for the protection and could not leave. Notable internees: Hideo Date, a painter; Catherine D. Owen, Associate Justice of the California 2nd District Court of Appeals; Frank S. Emmy, Hut Mountain Fair Play Committee leader and civil rights activist; Sadamitsu S. Neil Fujita, graphic designer who served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team; Evelyn Nakano Glenn, a professor of gender and women's studies and of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley and founding director of the Center for Race and Gender; also interned at Gila River. Joe Hayashi, 442nd RCT volunteer, posthumously awarded Medal of Honor. Bill Hosokawa, author and journalist, editor of the camp newspaper Heart Mountain Sentinel. Estella Shigard, an American artist married to a Nisei. George Ishiyama, businessman and former president of Alaska Pulp Corporation, also interned at Topaz. Lincoln Kanai, social worker and civil rights activist who brought a legal challenge to the eviction of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Kiyoshi Kuromiya, and author and civil and social justice advocate. Yoshi Kuromiya, Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee member who resisted the draft on constitutional grounds and promotes understanding of the Nisei draft resistors in film and public forums. Robert Kawahara, animator. Norman Mineta, United States Secretary of Transportation under George W. Bush and United States Secretary of Commerce under Bill Clinton. Lane Nakano, American soldier-turned-actor. Fusataro Nakaya, medical doctor, member of California Medical Association, vice president of Los Angeles Japanese Association. Shigeki Oka is a newspaper publisher who was recruited by the British Armed Forces in World War II. James K. Okubo, 442nd RCT veteran, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Albert Seijo, poet. Nyo Jensensaki, Rinzai Zen monk who was one of the 20th century's leading proponents of Zen Buddhism in the United States.